Everyone always has something to say about young people this, Gen Z that, and if we let them tell us what we are, we're in trouble. Keeping everything simple, let's dive into not getting profiled throughout our lives and the rest of our careers. Welcome back to the Keeping Everything Simple podcast. I'm your host and fellow student, Michael Klukas, and on this show, we boil down complicated topics into simple, actionable tips. So, I'm introducing a new segment here called The Breakdown, and contrary to popular beliefs, this is not going to be me having an emotional breakdown on camera or on audio for you guys. No. Instead, it's breaking down these common headlines, complicated misconceptions, and talking about what I've seen to be true about them, what's false, and what we can do moving forward as young workers and as leaders. First complicated conception that we're going to dive into is the statement that Gen Z is lazy, entitled, and not quote-unquote prepared for the real world and the workforce. Real quick though, before we continue on, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you do leave us a like and subscribe to the podcast. It means so much to me. If you listen to us on a podcast app of choice, leave us a 5-star rating. That's just to stoke my ego. And make sure that you also give us a follow so that way we can keep growing the show and I can keep bringing you more content just like this. Let's dive back in. So starting to break down some of the conception here that we're lazy, that we're entitled, yada, yada, yada. Additionally, contrary to popular belief, a majority, so 43% of young workers actually feel a little bit of loyalty towards their employer and towards their teams. And there's a statement that says we have this perception of Gen Z workers as a sort of cynical trudging into work, cashing the paycheck so they can have a good quality of life and quiet quit and do all these other things. But the thing is, that's not what tends to happen here. Another great example is when people talk about remote work and hybrid work, and there's tends to be this idea that Gen Z only wants to work remotely, but there's a decent portion of us that want actually just flexibility. And we want to be able to do good work and we want to work with people because we haven't been able to do that for a good portion of the start of our career, which is very formative for the rest of our career. But we're going to start the breakdown with a couple of things. It's going to be diving into the bits of truth and going into the falsehoods and ending on the simplified ideals. So the bits of truth here is the fact that Gen Z has different views on work than our predecessors. Gone are the days, of course, where working a single job from one breadwinner could land you college tuition. It could land you a house. It could land you a car, pensions. Those days don't exist anymore. The world that we came into for work looks very different. And that is extremely unsettling for so many because that means we have to look at what we were told and what the reality is today. And so our view on work has shifted to match that. We live in a world of rapid change, rapid layoff, rapid innovation, and we have to adjust constantly to those facts. Even though we are seen as digital natives, then that also means we're always looking at what's the next trend. We're always being told what the next trend is, and that gets exhausting. The biggest part here is the fact that even though our views on work revolve around how can I have a great work-life balance, how can I do great work, and how can I be super excited about what I do. Like I said a moment ago, in our formative years, in the start of our career, we were ushered into the pandemic, lockdown, and even though we had so many opportunities, normally, we went into this not knowing that we would spend the first 2, 3, 4 years of our working lives not getting to have those same experiences that those that came before us did. So our view on work has shifted. And then along with all the understanding about economics and all the understanding and just the stories we've seen from those as well who came before us, a view on work became less about I have to grind it out for 40 years and became more about I need to make sure that I and providing value, but that I'm not letting work become my life, not letting work become entirely who I am. And that's on to the point number 2. Like when I said our formative adult years were very skewed by the pandemic, it's a fact of the matter that for so many of those kind of transitional young adult moments that people tend to have, we didn't get them. At the very least, we had some attempts to make them matter, like high school graduations, college graduations, prom, internships, and in-person work experiences. These are things that normally tend to happen between these gap years, between these transitional phases of you going as a student to you going as a young working professional, and we didn't get them. And that's important to know for anyone who is older watching this. That's a very hard point for us to not be able to do, or not to be able to have, because ultimately we want to be able to continue the trajectory and feel optimistic about the future. But it's so important that we recognize the fact that things were very skewed because of the pandemic. And there's also this idea that goes around now that's in times of uncertainty, seniority, experience, and years in the field are valued more than untested talents. And I will say, logically, this makes a whole lot of sense. To me, logically, if you are a company that's struggling, if you are a company that wants to create these changes and wants to have people at the helm who are gonna really drive innovation, it makes sense to go for someone who knows what the field is like, has years under their belt, and has shown that they can weather the storms. I know this tends to be how we are looked at among Gen Z. Whenever we are entering into a new team, the previous team, the current team, has weathered some of the highs and the lows and has shown that they are able to stick around, stick it out, and do good work. But Gen Z is untested, and there is a fear generally among taking in new talent, because if the vetting process wasn't done well, if we can't see how well they handle pressure, if we can't see how well we are able to drive change and innovation, it becomes a gamble at times. And there's ways to mitigate that, of course, but the bit of the truth is it makes sense. And for all you who are in my generation, Gen Z, please don't hate me for that, but it honestly is true. It's a bit contrarian, but even though we have the knowledge, there's still a lack of skill. And that's something that has to be learned through true work experience, true experience in the field. But with that, let's dive into a bit of the falsehoods. But first off, I want you to comment this answer to the question. Do you feel prepared, or did you feel prepared when you entered the workforce for the first time? And no matter if you're younger, older, did you at that time feel ready for that next phase of life? Let me know in the comments below if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to us on a podcast app, then I will leave that as a Q&A for you guys to answer. So everybody has a story here. And that's where the most value is going to be found is sharing our stories. So let's dive into the falsehoods. The first falsehood is that Gen Z isn't able to handle the real world and work, and there's simply a larger lack of support in getting others up to speed and able to navigate different fields. Now, what I mean by this is it's not the fact that the pandemic skewed a lot of things. It's not the fact that there's been a shift in how we're prepared to enter the workforce. It's the fact that there's a lack of support. There's a lack of that consistent, I'd say, creation of skill, creation of etiquette. There's articles that go around about companies getting into etiquette classes, which makes sense to a degree. If you are helping people in their first ever job, okay, that makes sense. Some etiquette classes, professional etiquette, that's totally valid. However, if you are a Fortune 500 company and you are trying to have etiquette classes because you feel that Gen Z isn't quite up to par, then it has to be a question of less about Gen Z and more of a question about who are you hiring. Because there are great overachievers, there are average Joes, middle of the pack, and there are complete underachievers in every single generation. And that is something that I believe has stayed the same consistent throughout time, is there's always going to be someone who's going to go above and beyond, always going to be somebody who is going to want to do less and feel less driven and motivated, and that may result in a lifestyle that is not best suited for professional environments. And that doesn't mean they can't succeed, but it definitely means it's something that has to be considered. But there's been less support in getting us up to speed and up to par, because we should have been learning about some of this stuff while we were in university. We should have been having some of these experiences while we were in high school. I was lucky enough to be a TA, which helped me get a better understanding of how do I work with someone who's technically my boss. But again, it goes back to, it's less of an issue for the generation and more of an issue of how are we getting hired and who is being hired. Because a great example is in the recent news, Chipotle has gone through their hiring blitz for burrito season, which always sounds so funny to me, but it makes sense because peak seasons exist and a majority of their workforce is Gen Z. So you have to understand who your demographic is, who you're hiring for, and how you are hiring them. The next falsehood that comes to mind about being unprepared is this notion that we're lazy and that we don't want to work. But the truth behind that is in the matter that we want to have balanced work life. We want to be able to still go to the gym, see our friends, see our family, cook dinner after we get home from work. And of course, I've seen the TikToks, I've seen the articles where they express questions about what is the meaning of all of this? What is the meaning of life if we are just going to do the same job every single day and at the end of 40 years maybe be able to retire? The thing that we see, the thing that we have grown up seeing is that narrative shift, because we have seen unbalanced lives ruin people. We have seen unbalanced lives maybe because we've had impacts or that has impacted us in our youth, and now we see the impact of unbalanced lives as we enter the workforce and we see our older coworkers and we wonder, is that what my life will look like? And of course, all of this matters in context, because you can't put this as like a blanket statement, but I believe this little tool helps everybody, is that when you look at the older coworkers around you, you see technically what your career path might look like. If you have a manager, a leader, and they say they've been with the company for the past 15, 20 years, you have to look back and look at their life and say, is that a life I potentially want? Because that will be the role, that will be the job, and that will be the hours. But we see it instead as we want to go into this intentionally and say, I don't want to sacrifice the quality of my life for the quality of my career. I want to be able to find that solid middle ground, walk the line, and have a good life and a good job and feel good about both. Real quick though, before we continue on, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you do leave us a like and subscribe to the podcast. It means so much to me. If you listen to us on a podcast app of choice, leave us a 5-star rating. That's just to stoke my ego. And make sure that you also give us a follow so that way we can keep growing the show and I can keep bringing you more content just like this. Let's dive back in. And then that takes us into the third falsehood. Is like when companies used to call millennials lazy as well and called them entitled, and now with years of work under their belt and experience in the field, they are the ones generally looked to as candidates for leadership and management. And that narrative has instead shifted to target Gen Z. And that's something that is entirely false, because again, as I mentioned earlier, there are overachievers, middle of the pack, and underachievers in every single generation, every single category. And that doesn't mean that millennials were entitled, of course, when they entered the workforce during the great financial crisis. That's also a horrible time to get into your first job and your first career. However, it makes us have to take a step back and say, why does that narrative persist? Why does that narrative now shift its lens to Gen Z and say, you guys are lazy, you guys are entitled? Because with every piece of criticism, there is always going to be reasons for it to be true, and there's also going to be reasons for it to be blown out of proportion. And that is with the emphasis on life is different now than it was before, with technology, with our understanding of work, with our understanding of burnout, with our understanding of mental health. It's important that we know that it's less about entitlement and more about boundaries. It's less about being lazy and more about, well, am I on the path that makes the most sense to me? Because if we're on a path that we're passionate about, there is, I believe, a greater chance, a much, much greater chance that we are going to go the extra mile. But it has to be worth it. It has to make sense. It can't just be quietly working, going the quote unquote extra mile by putting in extra hours and not seeing those results for years. But this brings us to the segment of the show I like to call Simplified Ideals. So I call these ideals because there is no one-size-fits-all solution in the world of employment, personal fulfillment, and talent retention, because every situation is going to be slightly different and it has to be tweaked. So these are simplified ideals. The first one is that you're either part of the solution, part of the problem, or non-player. What I mean by that is if you are unprepared, if we're unprepared, so Gen Z, if we're unprepared, that fault lies with both parties. The people and the corporations who were supposed to get us geared up and ready to go. And then for those of us who didn't take enough initiative to make sure we felt ready and confident once we entered the workforce. Because ultimately, we would prefer things like training and mentorship that actually matters, certifications that allow us to get up to speed and on a faster path to catch up with our peers. That would be so much better than just band-aid solutions like etiquette classes. While the etiquette is important, it'd be so much more fun to have like a crash course on professionalism and career conduct, because it's something that has to be trained before we get into the workforce, but it is refined as we begin working. So that's why you're either part of the solution, you're part of the problem because you are either complaining and not providing any value towards it, or you're a non-player and you just kind of let it exist, which is perfectly fine too. But the second simplified idea here is that all generations have, again, those overachievers, the casuals, and the underperformers. And I'm going to keep repeating that, and I've been repeating that because it's so important to not kind of, I would say, stereotype everyone into one category or another, but it is important to recognize that that trend will exist no matter what. In your own life, no matter your generation, you probably know someone who has always gone above and beyond, they've always gone that extra mile, and it's always served them well. At the same time, you probably know somebody who always went a little less. They always put in a little less effort. They were kind of just coasting on through, but they did well enough. And then you probably know somebody who you just look at their life and you just wonder, what did you do? How did you get there? And how are you not able to dig yourself out of that hole? And that's important to really grapple with, because no generation is perfect. It's less about this, oh, back in my day and back when I was younger. There is always this ideation, this putting on a pedestal of when things were quote unquote simpler, or when it was simpler times. Life sucked back then too for people. Life sucks today for some people. Life was great back then for some people. Life is great today for some people. No generation is perfect, and that is something that you have to be honest with yourself about. And that's why this is a simplified ideal. Because, again, overachievers, middle of the pack, underachievers exist. No one's perfect. And so we have to be able to find out how are we raising the bar for each of them so that they can keep giving their best and being refined as they gain experience. And the final one here is that we want an emphasis on our lives, since we know on average we'll delay life milestones just like millennials have before us. And what I mean by that is things like getting a house, things like starting a family, things like actually getting married, big life milestones that come after graduation from university or high school. We're going to put those off. Why? Because for a decent portion of us, if it's a smarter financial decision, we're going to live at home for a longer stretch of time. We will juggle 2 jobs for a longer stretch of time. And this is just something that we recognize as creating that emphasis on why we want to be able to live our lives fully. And companies that earn loyalty are doing so by taking care of their employees, taking care of the team members, and that's doing it right. It's less of a story about being lazy and more of a story about not wanting to repeat the same mistakes as others before us, because the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We're not going to keep doing the same thing that we've seen others do and expect something else to happen. We're going to put an emphasis on that boundary setting. We're going to put an emphasis on our lives and the quality of life that we lead outside of the office, because that determines our performance in the office too. Even though you should be able to separate out your personal and professional life, they still impact each other whether you want them to or not. But that's why these 3 simplified ideals, I believe, encapsulate the entire current idea or the current conception here that Gen Z is lazy, entitled, and not at all prepared for the workforce, whereas instead, you're either part of the problem, you're part of the solution, or you're somewhere in between. No generation is perfect. There's overachievers, middle of the pack, and underachievers and everywhere. And we want to emphasize our lives because we know we will have to delay major milestones that the generations before us didn't have to. And again, it's a simplified ideal for any solution because a Fortune 500 company is going to have very different needs than, say, a small mom and pop shop. That's going to be 2 very different scenarios. Perspective is everything, and I truly mean it is everything, which is why we can't and we shouldn't let anyone assume we can't do exactly what needs to be done. Keeping everything simple. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure that you leave us a like, subscribe, so that way you can get notified when another episode comes out, and leave us a comment below on what is one takeaway or one simplified ideal you really enjoyed from this episode. If you're listening to us on a podcast app of choice, leave us a rating. It helps out so much, and give us a follow, so that way this show can continue to get recommended to other people just like you. But with that, I will see you all next time. Have an amazing day, you amazing people, and go out there and do great things.